the room went silent. You could hear a pin drop in New York's most exclusive restaurant as the most dangerous man in the city, Lorenzo Vanzetti, froze mid-sip of his wine. A trembling waitress had just committed the ultimate sin, interrupting the Don. But she didn't apologize. Instead, she stared at the heavy gold signet ring on his finger, a ring rumored to have been buried with his father, and whispered 7 words that would shatter his empire. "Sir-in-law, my mother has one too." Lorenzo turned pale, his hand drifting toward his holster. Was this an assassination attempt, or a ghost from a past he tried to burn? Stay tuned, because the truth is darker than you can imagine. The rain battered against the darkened windows of Le Sanctuary, a fortress of fine dining tucked away on East 61st Street. Inside, the air smelled of truffle oil, expensive perfume, and, tonight, fear. Sophie Miller adjusted her apron, her hands shaking slightly as she smoothed the fabric over her waist. She wasn't supposed to be working the floor tonight. She was usually relegated to the prep kitchen, slicing lemons and polishing silverware until her fingers were raw. But when Jessica, the head server, had called in with a migraine, which everyone knew meant she was hungover from partying in the meatpacking district, Sophie had been thrust into the shark tank. "Table 4, the manager, Mr. Henderson, hissed, shoving a heavy leather-bound wine list into her hands. "And for the love of God, Sophie, do not make eye contact unless he speaks to you. If you spill a drop, don't bother coming back tomorrow." Sophie swallowed hard. "Who is it, Mr. Henderson?" "Lorenzo Vanzetti." The name hit her like a physical blow. You didn't live in New York without knowing the Vanzetti name. They owned the unions, the docks, and half the politicians in Albany. Lorenzo, the current head of the family, was known in the tabloids as the Wolf of Tribeca. He was 42, impeccably dressed, and rumored to have killed a man with a fountain pen for disrespecting his sister. Sophie took a breath, pushed through the heavy velvet curtains, and stepped onto the floor. The restaurant was strangely quiet. Other diners spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously towards the corner booth. There he sat. Lorenzo Vanzetti was more terrifying in person than in the blurry paparazzi photos. He wore a charcoal Brioni suit that fit his broad shoulders like armor. His hair was slicked back, dark as oil, and his eyes were scanning the room with the predatory focus of a man who expects to be shot at during dinner. 2 bodyguards, thick-necked men named Rocco and Silas, stood discreetly by the pillars, their jackets bulging slightly at the waist. Sophie approached the table, clutching the wine list against her chest. Lorenzo was deep in conversation with a shorter, balding man. "Councilman Davies," she recognized from the news. "The permits are stalled, Lorenzo." Davies was sweating, despite the air conditioning. "The Inspector General is sniffing around the concrete pour on the Hudson Yards project." "I can't push it through yet." Lorenzo didn't raise his voice. He picked up his water glass, inspecting the clarity of the ice. "Andrew, you're confusing can't with won't. If the Inspector General is sniffing, perhaps he needs to find a bone to chew on. Or perhaps he needs to disappear." The councilman turned grey. "Good evening, gentlemen," Sophie said, her voice sounding thin and pathetic to her own ears. "May I start you with some wine?" Lorenzo stopped talking. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. For a second, Sophie felt like a deer caught in high beams. He didn't speak. He just stared, analyzing her face, her cheap earrings, the fraying collar of her uniform. "The 98 Barolo," Lorenzo said finally. His voice was a low rumble, surprisingly smooth. "And bring a glass for the councilman. He looks like he needs courage." Sophie nodded, rushing to the wine cellar. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She retrieved the bottle, a $3,000 vintage covered in dust, and returned to the table. This was the moment. The decanting. Mr. Henderson had practiced this with her for an hour. Cut the foil, wipe the rim, corkscrew in, pull. Don't pop it. She managed to open the bottle without incident. She poured a small amount for Lorenzo to taste. As she extended her arm, the sleeve of her uniform rode up slightly. Lorenzo reached out to take the glass. That was when the light from the crystal chandelier hit his hand. It was massive, a heavy antique gold signet ring on his pinky finger. The face of the ring wasn't a typical flat seal. It was an intricate carving of a two-headed hawk, its eyes set with tiny, blood-red rubies. But what made it unique was the damage, a deep, jagged scratch running diagonally across the left hawk's wing, as if it had deflected a knife blade years ago. Sophie froze. The bottle hovered dangerously in her hand. She knew that scratch. She knew that hawk. She had seen it 1,000 times, tracing the lines of it with her tiny fingers when she was a child, sitting on her mother's lap, while thunder rolled outside their drafty apartment in Queens. Without thinking, driven by a sudden, surreal shock that bypassed her survival instincts, Sophie spoke. "Sir," she whispered. Lorenzo paused, the glass halfway to his lips. He looked annoyed. "What?" Sophie pointed a trembling finger at his hand. "That ring. My mother has one too." The silence that followed was absolute. The clinking of forks in the restaurant stopped. Councilman Davies looked from Sophie to Lorenzo, his eyes widening in horror. Lorenzo Vanzetti set the glass down slowly. The liquid inside didn't ripple. He turned his hand over, looking at the ring, then back at Sophie. His face drained of color, turning a sickly pale beneath his tan. The casual menace in his eyes vanished, replaced by something far more volatile. Shock. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The ring," Sophie stammered, realizing too late that she had crossed a line. "The hawk, the scratch on the wing. My mother, she has the exact same one. She keeps it on a chain around her neck. She says it's the only thing my father left her." Lorenzo stood up. The chair scrapped loudly against the floor. Rocco and Silas, the bodyguards, instantly stepped forward, hands reaching into their jackets. "Clear the room," Lorenzo commanded. He didn't look at his men. He kept his eyes glued to Sophie. "Boss?" Rocco asked, confused. "I said clear the damn room," Lorenzo roared, slamming his hand onto the table. The glasses jumped. Councilman Davies scrambled out of the booth, knocking over his chair in his haste to flee. The other diners, sensing the shift from uncomfortable to lethal, began to grab their coats and run. Mr. Henderson appeared from the back, pale and shaking. "Mr. Vanzetti, please, is everything—" "Get out," Lorenzo snarled. "Everyone out, except her." Within 60 seconds, the restaurant was empty. The doors were locked. It was just Sophie, standing alone in the center of the room, facing the wolf of Tribeca. Lorenzo walked around the table. He loomed over her, radiating heat and violence. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, not painfully, but with a grip that made it clear she couldn't leave. "Who is your mother?" he demanded. Sophie's lip trembled. "Caterina. Her name is Caterina Russo." Lorenzo closed his eyes. He let out a breath that sounded like a wounded animal. When he opened them again, they were wet. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Caterina Russo died in the fire of 1999. I saw the house burn to the ground." "No," Sophie shook her head, tears spilling over. "She didn't die. She ran." Lorenzo Vanzetti was a man who prided himself on control. He controlled the shipping lanes, the concrete unions, and the flow of narcotics through the boroughs. He controlled his temper, his vices, and his enemies. But standing in the hollow silence of Le Sanctuary, gripping the wrist of a terrified 22-year-old waitress, he felt the foundations of his world cracking. Caterina. The name was a prayer and a curse he hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years. "She ran," Lorenzo repeated, his voice raspy. He released Sophie's wrist as if it burned him, stepping back to lean against the heavy oak table. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket, his hands shaking noticeably as he lit one. He didn't care about the restaurant's no-smoking policy. He owned the building. She told me she had to leave," Sophie said, rubbing her wrist. She was terrified, but the confusion on the mob boss's face gave her a strange surge of courage. He wasn't looking at her like a victim anymore. He was looking at her like a ghost. She said bad men were coming for us. She changed her name to Miller. We moved to Ohio for 10 years, then came back to Queens when she got sick. Lorenzo took a long drag, exhaling a plume of blue smoke toward the ceiling frescoes. "Sick? Cancer," Sophie said quietly. "That's why I'm working double shifts. The treatments are expensive." Lorenzo looked at her. Really looked at her. He stripped away the waitress uniform, the messy bun, the fatigue circles under her eyes. He looked at the structure of her face, the high cheekbones, the stubborn set of her jaw, and the eyes, hazel, with flecks of gold. Katerina's eyes. But the chin, that was his. That cleft in the chin was the Vanzetti mark, passed down from his grandfather, Don Antonio. "The ring," Lorenzo said, holding up his hand. "Tell me about the ring she has." "It's identical," Sophie insisted. "She told me there were two. A set. One for the king, one for the queen." She said. Sophie hesitated. "Say it," Lorenzo commanded, though his tone was softer now. She said she stole it. Lorenzo let out a short, bitter laugh. "She didn't steal it. I gave it to her, the night I asked her to marry me. 2 days before the fire." He turned to Rocco, who was standing by the door, looking uncharacteristically uneasy. "Bring the car around, the SUV, and call Dr. Aris. Tell him to meet us." "Where are we going, boss?" Rocco asked. "To Queen's," Lorenzo said, crushing the cigarette out on the pristine white tablecloth, leaving a black scar on the fabric. "We're going to visit a dead woman." The drive to Queen's was a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and suffocating silence. Sophie sat in the back of the armored Cadillac Escalade, sandwiched between Lorenzo and the leather door panel. She had tried to text her mother, to warn her, but Lorenzo had gently taken her phone. "No warnings," he had said. "If this is a trap, if you are working for the Moretti family or the feds, I want to see it in her eyes before the bullets start flying." "I'm a waitress," Sophie had snapped, fear making her reckless. "I don't know who the Morettis are. I just know you're scaring me." Lorenzo had looked out the window, watching the city lights blur. "I scare everyone, Sophie. It keeps me alive. But if you are who I think you are, you have nothing to fear, from me." They pulled up to a dilapidated apartment complex in Astoria. The brickwork was crumbling, and a neon sign for a 24-hour laundromat buzzed angrily across the street. It was a far cry from the penthouse suites and villas Lorenzo was used to. Sophie felt a wave of shame. She didn't want this man, with his $3,000 suit and polished shoes, to see the mold in the hallway or the way the radiator clanked. "Apartment 4B," Sophie whispered. Lorenzo signaled to his men. Rocco and Silas moved first, checking the hallway, hands on their weapons. Lorenzo followed, his movement fluid and silent. They reached the door. The paint was peeling. Lorenzo hesitated. For the first time in his life, the Wolf of Tribeca looked afraid to open a door. He nodded to Sophie. She unlocked it. The apartment was small, smelling of antiseptic, old tea, and damp wool. In the corner of the living room, a hospital bed had been set up. A woman lay there, frail and thin, her breathing shallow. Her hair, once the thick, dark mane Lorenzo remembered, was thin and greying. But her face, even ravaged by illness, it was Katerina. Lorenzo stepped into the room. The floorboards creaked. The woman in the bed stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at Sophie first, a weak smile forming. "Soph, you're home early." Then her gaze shifted. She saw the dark figure standing behind her daughter. She saw the silhouette of the man she had spent 22 years running from. Katerina gasped, struggling to sit up. The heart monitor beeped erratically. "Enzo?" she breathed. Lorenzo fell to his knees beside the bed. He ignored the dingy surroundings, the smell of sickness. He took her hand, a hand that was bone and skin. "Katerina," he choked out, "you're alive. Why? Why did you let me think you burned? I tore the city apart. I killed men who had nothing to do with it, because I needed someone to blame." Katerina gripped his hand with surprising strength. Tears streamed down her face. "I had to, Enzo. I had to run." "Why?" "Because of him," she whispered, looking past Lorenzo to the doorway. Lorenzo turned, but there was no one there but Rocco. "Who?" Lorenzo demanded, turning back to her. "Who were you running from?" Katerina reached into the neck of her nightgown and pulled out a gold chain. Hanging from it was the ring, the twin hawk. She pressed it into Lorenzo's palm. "I wasn't running from your enemies, Enzo," she coughed, a harsh, rattling sound. "I was running from your brother. I was running from Marco." Lorenzo froze. His blood ran cold. Marco Vanzetti, his younger brother, his underboss, the man who sat at his right hand at every Sunday dinner, the man who had held Lorenzo while he wept at Caterina's funeral. "Marco?" Lorenzo said, the name tasting like ash. "Marco loved you. He was the one who found the body. He identified the dental records. He faked them," Caterina hissed, her eyes wide with a terror that spanned 2 decades. "He came to me 2 days after you proposed. He told me that if I married you, he would kill me. He said he wanted me for himself, but if he couldn't have me, no one would. He set the fire, Enzo. He dragged me out the back before the roof collapsed and told me to run and never look back. He said if I ever contacted you, he would kill our child." Lorenzo looked at Sophie. Sophie stood by the window, her hands over her mouth, processing the lie she had lived her whole life. "Our child," Lorenzo repeated. He looked at Sophie, then back at Caterina. "Sophie is—" "She's yours, Enzo," Caterina sobbed. "She's a Vanzetti. And Marco. He's been watching. He knows we're back in New York. I saw his car outside the laundromat yesterday." Just then, Rocco's earpiece crackled. He tapped it, his face going grim. "Boss," Rocco said, his voice tight. "We have a problem." "Not now," Lorenzo snapped, not taking his eyes off Caterina. "Boss, you need to look out the window," Rocco insisted, drawing his gun. "We're surrounded. 4 SUVs just blocked the street. They aren't cops." Lorenzo stood up, walking to the window. He peered through the blinds. Down on the rain-swept street, men were pouring out of black Suburbans. They were carrying automatic rifles. And leading them, standing calmly under a black umbrella, looking up at the 4th-floor window with a smirk, was a man Lorenzo knew better than his own reflection. Marco. Lorenzo turned back to the 2 women, his dying love and his newfound daughter. The shock in his eyes hardened into a diamond-sharp rage. The Wolf of Tribeca was back. "Sophie," Lorenzo said, his voice deadly calm. "Get down, Rocco. Give me your spare piece." "What are we going to do?" Sophie cried, rushing to her mother's side. Lorenzo checked the magazine of the pistol and racked the slide. He looked at the door. "We're going to have a family reunion." The first bullet shattered the window, sending shards of glass spraying across the laminate floor. "Down!" Lorenzo roared, tackling Sophie and covering her body with his own massive frame. The sound of automatic gunfire erupted from the street below, tearing through the thin drywall of the apartment. Plaster dust exploded into the air, choking the room in a white haze. The noise was deafening, a continuous, ripping sound that turned the quiet Queen's night into a war zone. "Rocco, suppress them!" Lorenzo barked, rolling off Sophie and dragging her behind the overturned, heavy oak sofa. "Silas, get the back door. If they breach the hallway, we're dead in a box." Rocco, a veteran of the Vanzetti enforcement squad, didn't flinch. He kicked the shattered window frame out and mounted his weapon on the sill, firing controlled bursts down into the street. "I see 4 shooters, boss. They're moving to the entrance. Marco is hanging back by the limo." Lorenzo looked at Caterina. She was huddled in the hospital bed, trembling violently, her hands pressed over her ears. The machinery monitoring her vitals was screaming a high-pitched alarm that cut through the gunfire. "Well, we have to move her," Lorenzo said, his eyes wild but his voice steady. He looked at Sophie. "Can you carry the oxygen tank? It's heavy." Sophie looked at the chaos, the bullets chewing up the walls, the terrifying man she had served wine to an hour ago, now commanding a squad of killers, and she felt a strange calm settle over her. It was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the blood. "I can take it," Sophie said, grabbing the portable tank. "Silas!" Lorenzo yelled. "Status!" "They're in the stairwell!" Silas shouted from the hallway, his voice straining over the sound of boots pounding up the stairs. "2 floors down. We have maybe 30 seconds. "We're not going out the front," Lorenzo decided instantly. He moved to the kitchen. It was a cramped galley style with a single window facing an alleyway. "Fire escape, now!" He scooped Caterina up from the bed as if she weighed nothing. She was so light, frail as a bird, wrapped in the thin hospital blankets. She clung to his suit jacket, burying her face in his chest. "I've got you, Cat," he whispered into her hair, a moment of tenderness amidst the violence. "I've got you!" Rocco fired one last volley to keep the shooters' heads down, then retreated, reloading his magazine with a metallic click-clack. "Go, boss, I'll hold the door." "No heroes, Rocco," Lorenzo growled, kicking the kitchen window open. "You follow us. That's an order." They scrambled out onto the rusted metal grating of the fire escape. The rain was torrential now, slicking the iron steps and soaking them instantly. The cold was a shock after the heat of the apartment. Below them, the alley was dark, a canyon of wet brick and overflowing dumpsters. "Down!" Lorenzo commanded. "Fast!" Sophie went first, the heavy oxygen tank banging against her hip. Lorenzo followed, shielding Katerina's body from the exposure of the open air. Silas brought up the rear, his gun trained on the window they had just exited. They reached the second-floor landing when the apartment door above them was kicked in. "Boom! Clear!" a voice shouted from inside Sophie's apartment. "They're gone! Check the window!" "Move!" Lorenzo urged. As they hit the ground level of the alley, a silhouette appeared in the window 3 floors up. A muzzle flashed. Crack-thwip. A bullet sparked off the metal railing inches from Sophie's head. She screamed, stumbling into a pile of wet cardboard boxes. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He shifted Katerina to his left arm, raised his pistol with his right, and fired 3 shots upward. The silhouette in the window jerked back and disappeared. "The car!" Rocco panted, appearing beside them. "The SUV is out front. We can't get to it." "We don't need the SUV," Lorenzo said, scanning the alley. His eyes landed on a beat-up Ford cargo van, parked behind the laundromat. It had Pete's Plumbing stenciled on the side. "Hotwire it," Lorenzo ordered Silas. "Boss, that's a piece of junk," Silas argued, eyeing the rust. "It's a ghost car." "Marco is looking for an armored Cadillac. He won't look for a plumber. Do it!" Silas smashed the driver's side window with the butt of his gun and vaulted inside. Within 10 seconds, the engine sputtered and roared to life. Lorenzo slid the side door open. "Get in. Sophie, keep your mother's head down." They piled into the back of the van among PVC pipes and buckets of joint compound. It smelled of stale coffee and putty. Lorenzo sat on the floor, cradling Katerina, while Rocco took the passenger seat. As Silas gunned the engine and peeled out of the alley, tires screeching on the wet pavement, a black Suburban rounded the corner. "Contact!" Rocco yelled, leaning out the window to fire. The Suburban swerved, its windshield shattering under Rocco's fire. Silas slammed the plumbing van into a hard right turn, bouncing over the curb and tearing down a one-way street the wrong way. Horns blared as oncoming traffic swerved to avoid them. Lorenzo didn't look back. He was focused entirely on the woman in his arms. Katerina was pale, her breathing ragged. "The tank!" Lorenzo snapped at Sophie. "Hook her up, now!" Sophie's hands shook as she attached the cannula to her mother's nose and twisted the valve. The hiss of oxygen filled the cramped van. "Is she okay?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Lorenzo checked Katerina's pulse. It was thready, fluttering like a trapped moth. He looked up at Sophie, his eyes dark and unreadable. "She's holding on," he said. Then he looked at the ring on his finger, and the identical one resting against Katerina's chest. "We're going to the iron loft. No one knows about it except me. Not even Marco." Sophie wiped rain and tears from her face. "You said Marco is your brother. Why does he want to kill us?" Lorenzo looked out the back window at the fading lights of Queens. His expression hardened into something carved from granite. "Because," Lorenzo said quietly, "Marco has always wanted to be the king, and he knows that as long as I have a queen and an heir, he's nothing but a spare part." He looked at Sophie, really seeing her in the dim light of the street lamps passing by. "He isn't just trying to kill me, Sophie. He's trying to erase me. And now that he knows you exist, you are the most dangerous thing in his world." The Iron Loft was not a loft in the artistic sense. It was a fortified safe house located in an abandoned industrial sector of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. From the outside, it looked like a derelict warehouse, covered in graffiti and surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Inside, however, it was a fortress. Silas drove the plumbing van into the freight elevator, and they ascended to the top floor. The steel doors groaned open to reveal a sprawling, open-plan space fitted with medical equipment, a fully stocked armory, and living quarters that rivaled a five-star hotel. Lorenzo carried Caterina to the medical bay, a sterile room separated by glass walls. A man was already waiting there, Dr. Aris, a Greek trauma surgeon who had lost his license years ago and now worked exclusively for the Vanzetti family. "Stabilize her," Lorenzo commanded, placing Caterina gently on the gurney. "She has stage 4 lung cancer. She's been without her meds for 3 hours and has been subjected to high stress." Dr. Aris nodded, immediately getting to work, checking pupils and hooking up monitors. "I need everyone out." "Let me work." Lorenzo hesitated, his hand lingering near Caterina's. Then he stepped back, the glass door sliding shut, sealing the sound of the medical machines inside. He turned to the main room. Sophie was standing by a long metal table, hugging her arms around herself. She was shivering, her waitress uniform soaked and stained with drywall dust. Lorenzo walked over to a heavy mahogany wardrobe. He pulled out a thick cashmere sweater and a pair of sweatpants. "Put these on," he said, handing them to her. "You'll catch pneumonia." Sophie took them. "Thank you." She disappeared into the bathroom to change. When she came out, she looked tiny in the oversized clothes, the sleeves hanging past her hands. She looked young, vulnerable, but her jaw was set in that stubborn line that reminded Lorenzo so much of himself. "Here," Lorenzo said, sliding a glass of amber liquid across the table. "Brandy. It helps with the shock." Sophie sat down opposite him. She took a sip, coughing as the alcohol burned her throat. "I don't drink much." "Start," Lorenzo said grimly. He poured himself a double and downed it in one go. "So," Sophie said, placing the glass down, "you're him. The wolf. The man everyone in the restaurant was terrified of." "Yes." "And you're my father." Lorenzo twirled his glass. "Biologically, yes. But I haven't earned the title. I wasn't there." "You didn't know," Sophie pointed out. "Mum said..." "She said she hid to protect us." "She hid because my brother is a monster," Lorenzo corrected. His voice dropped an octave. "I trusted Marco with my life. When Caterina died in that fire, Marco held me while I cried. He swore vengeance on whoever set the blaze. All along, he was the one holding the matches." Lorenzo's hand tightened around the glass until it cracked. A shard sliced into his palm, but he didn't seem to notice the blood. "Why?" Sophie asked softly. "Why did he do it?" "Jealousy," Lorenzo said, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and wrapping his hand. "Marco and I. We were rivals growing up. But I was the eldest. The crown prince. Everything came to me first. The business, the respect, and Caterina." Lorenzo looked towards the medical bay where Dr. Aris was working. Marco wanted her. He was obsessed. When she chose me, something in him broke. He decided if he couldn't have her, he would destroy her, and by killing her, he broke me too. For 20 years, I have been a ghost. I built this empire, I expanded the territory, but I was empty. Marco liked that. He liked controlling the empty shell of his big brother. He looked at Sophie. "But I'm not empty anymore." Sophie felt a chill go down her spine. The look in his eyes was terrifying, yet it made her feel safer than she had ever felt in her life. Just then, Rocco walked into the room. He had a tablet in his hand. His face was grave. "Boss, you need to see this." Lorenzo took the tablet. Sophie leaned in to look. It was a live news broadcast. The banner at the bottom read, "Breaking news. Shootout in Astoria." A polished news anchor was speaking. "Police are investigating a violent altercation in Queens tonight. Sources say it is linked to organized crime." In a shocking turn of events, a statement has been released by the Vanzetti family lawyer. The screen cut to a press conference. Standing at the podium was a slick lawyer, but standing behind him, looking solemn and grieving, was Marco Vanzetti. The lawyer spoke. "It is with heavy hearts that we announce that Lorenzo Vanzetti, the head of our business interests, has suffered a severe mental break. Earlier tonight, in a fit of paranoid delusion, Lorenzo attacked his own security detail and kidnapped a young woman and her sick mother. We fear he is a danger to himself and others. The family is cooperating fully with the authorities to bring him in safely." Sophie gasped. He's blaming you? He's saying you kidnapped us?" Lorenzo stared at the screen, watching his brother's fake expression of concern. Marco wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. "He's smart," Lorenzo muttered. "He's cutting off my support. If I'm insane, my captains won't follow my orders. They'll follow Marco, the stable brother. He's staging a coup." Lorenzo stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the rainy dockyards. "He thinks he's won," Lorenzo said. "He thinks I'm on the run. He thinks I'm just a man with a gun." He turned back to Sophie. The transformation was complete. The shock was gone. The father was gone. The Don was back. "Rocco," Lorenzo commanded, "open the armory and get me the red book." Rocco's eyes widened. "The red book? Boss, that's the nuclear option. That contains the dirt on every judge, senator, and rival boss in the city." "Exactly," Lorenzo said. He walked over to Sophie and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Marco wants a war. I'll give him an apocalypse. But first, we need to make sure you stay alive." Lorenzo reached into his pocket and pulled out his ring, the twin hawk with the scratched wing. He took Sophie's hand. Her fingers were slender, rough from years of washing dishes. He slid the heavy gold ring onto her thumb. It was the only finger it would fit. "Wear this," he said. "Why?" Sophie asked, looking at the heavy gold. "Because in our world this isn't jewelry," Lorenzo said. "It's a flag. It tells everyone who sees it that you're under the protection of the Capo Dei Capi. If anyone touches you, they aren't just hurting a girl. They are declaring war on me." Suddenly the lights in the warehouse flickered. Then they died completely, plunging the room into darkness. The hum of the backup generator didn't kick in. "Rocco!" Lorenzo shouted, drawing his weapon in the dark. "I'm trying!" Rocco yelled from the control panel. "The system's been hacked! They cut the external power!" "They found us," Silas said, his voice tight. "How the hell did they find us?" Lorenzo grabbed Sophie, pulling her down behind the kitchen island. "The phone," Lorenzo realized, cursing himself. "Sophie, did you have your phone on you?" "Yes," she whispered, "in my pocket. But it's off." "It doesn't matter," Lorenzo hissed. "Marco has the NYPD on his payroll. They pinged the tower." A heavy mechanical whirring sound came from the freight elevator. The gears were grinding. Someone was overriding the lift controls. Lorenzo checked his magazine. He had 12 rounds. Rocco had a shotgun. Silas had a pistol. And coming up the elevator were likely 20 of the best hitmen money could buy. "Sophie," Lorenzo whispered, pressing his forehead against hers in the dark. "Listen to me carefully. There is a ventilation shaft behind the refrigerator. It leads to the roof. Go." "I'm not leaving you," Sophie cried. "I'm not leaving Mum." "Your mother is safer with the doctor," Lorenzo said. "They want me, and they want you. If you are here, they will use you to make me surrender. If you are gone, I can fight." The elevator chimed. It had reached the floor. "Go!" Lorenzo shoved her towards the kitchen. As Sophie scrambled into the shadows, the elevator doors blasted open. Flashlights cut through the darkness, blinding and erratic. "Lorenzo Vanzetti!" Marco's voice echoed through the vast warehouse, amplified and mocking. "Come out, brother. I brought you a retirement present." Lorenzo stood up from behind the island, leveling his gun at the blinding lights. "Come and give it to me, Marco," he roared. The muzzle flashes lit up the dark like a strobe light party from hell. Sophie scrambled into the dark, narrow space behind the refrigerator. The ventilation shaft was tight, smelling of dust and grease, the metal cold against her palms. Behind her, the warehouse erupted into chaos. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening, a cacophony of cracks and booms that vibrated through the floorboards and into her bones. "Keep moving," she told herself. "Don't stop. Don't think." She crawled, her knees scraping against the rivets of the ductwork. She could hear shouting below, Lorenzo's deep, commanding roar, and the high-pitched, mocking laughter of his brother, Marco. "You're getting slow, Enzo," Marco taunted, his voice muffled through the metal walls. "You care too much. That's why you were always weak." Sophie grit her teeth. Her father, a man she had known for less than 2 hours, was down there dying for her. She couldn't just run, but Lorenzo had been clear. If you are gone, I can fight. She saw a grate ahead, faint grey light filtering through the slats. The roof access. She kicked the grate hard. It clattered away, sliding down the wet asphalt of the roof outside. Sophie pulled herself out, gasping as the freezing rain hit her face. The roof of the iron loft was a desolate landscape of black tar, HVAC units, and rusting satellite dishes. The New York skyline glittered in the distance, indifferent to the war happening in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Sophie stood up, the oversized sweatpants heavy with water. She looked around for a fire escape, a ladder, anything. "Going somewhere, Princess." The voice came from the shadows of a large, cooling tower. Sophie spun around. A man stepped out. He was dressed in tactical black gear, a night vision monocle pushed up on his forehead. He held a combat knife, the blade non-reflective and serrated. It was one of Marco's men. He had anticipated the escape route. "Please," Sophie whispered, backing away until her heels hit the low parapet wall. It was a 4-story drop to the concrete below. "I'm just a waitress." The man grinned. It was a cold, professional expression. "Not anymore. Tonight you're loose ends. And Marco hates loose ends." He lunged. Sophie didn't think. She didn't have combat training. She didn't have a weapon. But she had spent 5 years working in the busiest kitchens in Manhattan, dodging hot pans, slippery floors, and aggressive customers. She had reflexes. As the knife slashed toward her throat, Sophie dropped. She grabbed a handful of loose gravel from the tar roof and threw it into the man's eyes. He roared, stumbling back, pouring at his face. "You little—" Sophie looked around. A rusted iron pipe lay near the edge of the roof, debris from a past construction job. She grabbed it. It was heavy, corroded, and rough. The hitman blinked the grit from his eyes and charged again, blind rage replacing his professional calm. Sophie swung. She channeled 22 years of fear, of hiding, of watching her mother wither away in poverty, while men like this lived in palaces. She swung with the weight of the Vanzetti bloodline she barely knew she had. Clang! The pipe connected with the man's knee. There was a sickening crunch. The hitman screamed, his leg buckling under him. He hit the wet tar face first. Sophie didn't wait for him to get up. She raised the pipe again, her breathing ragged, prepared to strike. But before she could, a blinding spotlight washed over the roof, freezing them both in place. The deafening thwump, thwump, thwump of rotor blades beat the air, whipping Sophie's wet hair across her face. A helicopter rose from the dark side of the building, hovering like a giant predatory insect. It wasn't a police chopper. It was sleek, black, and had no markings. The side door slid open. A man sat there, legs dangling over the edge, holding a heavy assault rifle. Sophie dropped the pipe, raising her hands. Marco won, she thought. He has air support. The man in the helicopter raised his rifle. He aimed. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut. Bang, bang. She flinched, waiting for the impact. But it never came. She heard a wet thud on the roof. She opened her eyes. The hitman, the one with the broken knee, was lying motionless on the tar, 2 red holes in his chest. The helicopter hovered closer. The man with the rifle lowered it and gestured for her to come. He shouted something over the roar of the engine, but she couldn't hear. Then the pilot turned the helicopter slightly, revealing a logo painted in matte grey on the tail. It wasn't the Vanzetti hawk. It was a bear. Sophie's heart hammered. She remembered a story she'd heard at the restaurant once, whispered by a drunk patron. The Vanzettis own the streets. But the Russians? The Russians own the sky. The door gunner threw a rope ladder down. It slapped against the wet roof. "Climb!" he screamed, his accent thick and Slavic. "If you want to live, climb!" Sophie hesitated. Below her, the shooting in the warehouse had intensified. Lorenzo was down there. As if reading her mind, the trapdoor she had climbed out of exploded open. Rocco burst onto the roof, dragging Lorenzo. Lorenzo was limping badly. His suit was shredded, and blood was soaking through the white shirt at his shoulder. He was firing his pistol backward into the hole with one hand, while Rocco hauled him. "Boss! The bird!" Rocco yelled, pointing at the helicopter. Lorenzo looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw the Russian markings. He didn't look relieved. He looked calculated. "Go!" Lorenzo shoved Rocco towards the ladder. "Get the girl up!" Rocco grabbed Sophie, practically throwing her onto the rope ladder. "Climb, kid, don't look down." Sophie scrambled up the swaying rungs, the wind buffeting her. Hands grabbed her jacket and hauled her into the cabin of the helicopter. She tumbled onto the metal floor. She scrambled to the door, looking down. Rocco was halfway up. Lorenzo was at the bottom of the ladder, one hand on the rung, the other still firing his gun at the roof access door, where Marco's men were now pouring out. "Enzo!" Sophie screamed, the name ripping from her throat. Bullets sparked off the helicopter's fuselage. The pilot cursed in Russian and yanked the stick back. The helicopter lurched upward. Lorenzo lost his footing on the wet roof, but he held onto the ladder with a grip of iron. He dangled hundreds of feet in the air as the chopper swung away from the building, leaving Marco Vanzetti standing on the roof, screaming in frustration, his figure shrinking into the rainy night. The interior of the helicopter smelled of jet fuel and expensive cologne. Sophie huddled in the corner, wrapped in a wool blanket someone had thrown at her. Opposite her, Lorenzo sat on a jump seat, while Rocco applied a pressure bandage to the gunshot wound in his shoulder. Lorenzo didn't flinch as Rocco tightened the dressing. He was staring at the man sitting in the luxury leather captain's chair at the back of the cabin. The man was older, with a shock of white hair and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from a glacier. He wore a tuxedo, as if he had been plucked from the opera. He was sipping vodka from a crystal glass, completely unbothered by the turbulence. "You look terrible, Lorenzo," the man said, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in the small cabin. "Victor," Lorenzo nodded, wincing slightly as the helicopter banked. "I didn't know you were in town." "I am always in town when things get interesting," Victor Volkov replied. "And tonight is very interesting. The Vanzetti family at war with itself. A dead brother attacking a living one. It is like Shakespeare, da?" Victor's ice-blue eyes shifted to Sophie. He studied her for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped to her hand. He saw the ring. His eyebrows rose. And this must be the little bird that started the storm, the lost daughter. Sophie pulled the blanket tighter. "Who are you?" "I am the man who just saved your life, Malaya," Victor said smoothly. "I am Victor Volkov. Your father and I have an understanding." "An understanding?" Lorenzo scoffed, buttoning his ruined jacket. "I let you run your shipments through the Red Hook terminals without tax. That's the understanding. And in exchange, I do not burn the terminals down." Victor smiled, a predatory flash of gold teeth. "But tonight, the price has gone up. I just extracted the head of the Vanzetti family from a kill box. That is worth more than tax-free shipping." "Name your price," Lorenzo said, his voice hard. "But if you try to leverage her," he pointed at Sophie, "I will crash this bird myself." Victor laughed. "Relax, Wolf. I have no need for hostages. I need stability. Marco is a cowboy. He is reckless. If he takes over New York, the police heat will be unbearable for business. I prefer you. You are..." "Rational," the pilot shouted something from the cockpit. "We are approaching the landing zone," Victor announced. "My private yacht. You will be safe there. It is international territory, technically." The helicopter began to descend. Sophie looked out the window. Below them, a massive super yacht sat in the dark waters of the Hudson, lit up like a floating palace. "My mother," Sophie realized suddenly, panic seizing her chest. "We left her. She's with Dr. Aris at the warehouse." Lorenzo shook his head. "No. While you were in the vent, I saw Aris. He took her out the back way, through the old sewage tunnels. Marco wouldn't check there. Too dirty for his Italian leather shoes. Aris is taking her to St. Judas. The nuns there owe me a favor." "She is safe, Sophie." Sophie let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked at Lorenzo. His face was grey, slick with sweat. The blood loss was getting to him. "You're hurt bad," she said. "I've had worse," Lorenzo muttered, though his eyelids were drooping. The helicopter touched down on the helipad of the yacht, the Tsarina. Armed guards in white naval uniforms swarmed the deck to escort them. They were led into a lavish stateroom. Victor poured 3 drinks. "To survival," Victor toasted. Lorenzo didn't drink. He slumped onto a velvet sofa. "We need a plan, Victor. Marco has the media, the cops, and the element of surprise. He's seized my accounts. I can't pay my soldiers. By morning, half my captains will defect to him, just to keep their paychecks coming." "Money is not your problem," Victor said, sitting down and crossing his legs. "I have money. I can fund your war, Lorenzo. For a percentage of future earnings, of course." "Of course," Lorenzo said dryly. "But money isn't enough. Marco has legitimacy. He has the lawyers saying I'm insane. I need to prove he's the one who broke the code." Sophie stood up. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted, but her mind was racing. She thought about the restaurant. She thought about the way the councilman had looked at Lorenzo. "The Red Book," Sophie said. Lorenzo looked up. "What?" "In the warehouse," Sophie said. "Before the lights went out, you asked Rocco for the Red Book. You said it was the nuclear option." Lorenzo closed his eyes. "It's gone. It was in the safe in the office. Marco controls the building now. He has the book. If he destroys it, I lose my leverage over the judges. If he publishes it, he takes us all down." "He won't destroy it," Rocco chimed in, standing by the door. "Marco is greedy. He'll use it. He wants to be the king. That book is the crown." "But he can't open it," Lorenzo said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Because it's a biometric safe," Lorenzo tapped his temple, "and it requires 2 keys, my fingerprint, and a voice phrase that only one other person knew." "Katerina," Sophie whispered. "Yes," Lorenzo said. "Marco thinks he has the kingdom, but he locked himself out of the treasury. He needs me dead to take my spot, but he needs your mother alive to open the book." Lorenzo sat up straighter, the pain momentarily forgotten. That's why he didn't kill her 20 years ago, Lorenzo realized, the horror dawning on him. He didn't just want her for obsession. He knew she knew the phrase. He kept her alive, waiting for the day he could use her. "But Mum is safe," Sophie said. "You said she's with the nuns." Lorenzo's phone buzzed. It was a burner phone he had swiped from the warehouse. He looked at the screen. His face went from pale to ghostly white. The phone dropped from his hand onto the thick carpet. "Lorenzo?" Sophie stepped forward. "What is it?" Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes hollow. "That was Dr. Aris," he whispered. "They didn't make it to the convent. Marco's men intercepted the ambulance." Sophie felt the room spin. "No, he has her," Lorenzo said, his voice breaking. "He has Katerina, and he sent a message. What does it say?" Victor asked, leaning forward, the game suddenly becoming serious. Lorenzo looked at Sophie, his expression filled with a sorrow so deep it looked like it would drown them all. "He says I have until midnight tomorrow to surrender. If I don't walk into his penthouse and put a bullet in my own head, he will finish what the fire started in 1999. Sophie looked at the heavy gold ring on her thumb. The hawk with the broken wing. She thought of her mother, coughing in that hospital bed. She thought of Marco's smirk. She stopped shaking. She walked over to the table and picked up the glass of vodka Victor had poured. She drank it in one swallow, the liquid fire burning away the fear. She slammed the glass down. It didn't break. "We aren't going to surrender," Sophie said. Her voice didn't sound like a Waitress anymore. It sounded like a Vanzetti. Lorenzo looked at her, surprised by the steel in her tone. "We're going to that penthouse," Sophie declared, "and we're going to take back what is ours." The penthouse elevator chimed at exactly midnight. Lorenzo Vanzetti stepped into the room, hands raised, his jacket open to show he was unarmed. Across the expanse of the luxury suite, Marco sat behind the massive mahogany desk, a revolver pressed against Katerina's temple. She was slumped in a wheelchair, barely conscious. "You're late, Enzo," Marco sneered. "I was about to paint the walls." "Let her go," Lorenzo said, his voice deadly calm. "You want the Red Book. You need my fingerprint. Kill her, and you get nothing." "I have your print," Marco said, tapping the biometric scanner on the leather-bound ledger. "But I need the voice activation phrase. She knows it." He yanked Katerina's hair back. "Wake up and sing, Kara." "She can't speak," a voice cut from the shadows. Sophie stepped into the light. She wore a black dress and a look of cold fury that mirrored her father's. "Sophie," Lorenzo barked, "I told you to run." "I know the phrase," Sophie interrupted, ignoring him. She walked steadily toward Marco. Mum whispered it in her sleep for years. Marco hesitated, greed warring with suspicion. He saw the heavy gold signet ring on Sophie's thumb. "Tell me." "I have to whisper it," Sophie said, stopping inches from the gun. "It's for the king's ears only." Marco lowered the weapon slightly, leaning in. "Say it." Sophie looked him dead in the eye. "The phrase is, 'Look behind you.'" Crash! The floor-to-ceiling window behind the desk exploded. Rocco swung through the shattering glass on a rappel line, boots slamming into Marco's chest. Lorenzo moved like a blur. As Marco scrambled to recover his gun, Lorenzo was on him. He didn't fight with honor. He fought with 20 years of rage. He slammed Marco's head into the floor, once, twice, until the fight left his brother's eyes. "You wanted the crown," Lorenzo roared, standing over him. "It's too heavy for you. The police are coming." Marco spat blood, laughing weakly. "You'll go to jail, Enzo. You're done." Lorenzo straightened his tie and walked to the desk. He placed his thumb on the scanner. Beep. Then he looked at Sophie. "Give me the ring." Sophie handed it to him. Lorenzo pressed the hawk-shaped crest into a hidden indentation on the book's spine. Click. The ledger sprang open. There was never a voice phrase, Lorenzo revealed, pulling out a flash drive hidden inside. The ring was always the key. He tossed the drive to Rocco. "Upload it. Every bribe, every hit, every arson Marco committed since 1999. Send it to the FBI." Marco went pale. "That drive destroys the whole family." "No," Lorenzo said, kneeling beside Caterina and taking her hand. "It destroys you. I'm retired." Sirens wailed in the street below. Lorenzo didn't run. He simply pulled Sophie and Caterina close, waiting for the police to come for his brother. The wolf of Tribeca was gone. Finally, he was just a father. And that is the story of how a waitress brought an empire to its knees with just 7 words. From the humble floors of Le Sanctuary to the bloody penthouse showdown, Sophie proved that the strongest bloodline isn't about power. It's about loyalty. Lorenzo reclaimed his family, not by winning the war, but by ending it. If you enjoyed this twist-filled Mafia saga, please smash that like button. It helps the channel immensely. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Do you think Sophie will eventually take over the business? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.